This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. I want to take a moment to tell you about a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute called Identity Crisis. This podcast is creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. It's hosted by Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who sits down with a wide range of guests, politicians, authors, writers, and more to discuss current events, Jewish values, and the big questions facing Jewish life. This podcast has a genuine curiosity and humility about the critical and complex issues, everything from what it means to be a Jewish leader during this divisive moment to the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel today. You will find Identity Crisis enriching and enlivening. Check it out, Identity/Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, May 26th, 1970, we are at the White House for a ceremony with President Richard Nixon and a group of labor leaders. The 22 labor leaders, representing some 300,000 union workers, present Nixon with some ceremonial hard hats, and there's an important photo op for all of them. But the leaders aren't there to commemorate a new contract or advocate for better working conditions or union support from the administration. They are there, in fact, for a photo op and to fan the culture wars. And Nixon is more than happy to play along. He remarked, as he was surrounded by these guys in hard hats, that, quote, labor leaders and people from middle America still have character and guts and a bit of patriotism. And gosh, does that language sound familiar, as Republicans have continued to use that idealized version of industrial workers to create this real America versus fake America divide, even as their policies towards labor and unions in particular have felt a little suspect over the decades. But really, in this moment, you can see this divide opening up, the labor and culture wars bursting into the open, and it wasn't just an isolated incident. So, here to discuss this moment when the Dems started to lose the labor culture wars, and we'll get into the so-called hard hat riots of 1970. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Wearing your hard hats I see on this taping, just
yes.
like real Americans, you know, salt of the earth types.
Very YMCA.
I guess there's that.
Kellie's like, it's complete camp.
My gosh. Hadn't thought that we were going to talk about YMCA, but that's around the same era too, and really scrambles this sort of culture, labor, hard hat trope. We should do an episode on the political valiance of the song YMCA.
Especially because I think one remaining Village person is a Trump supporter.
Yeah. All right. Well, didn't think that was going to be what we were talking about right off the bat, but you know what? Put it on the list. Excellent. So let me do a little background, non-disco background for 1970 and this moment that we're in right now, and then we'll talk about the hard hat riot and labor culture, hippies versus hard hats, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously, post-war America, 50s and 60s, labor unions in particular build the American middle class, industrialization. We get into the 60s into the 70s. In the early 70s, of course, there's the Vietnam War. What we're talking about, the spring of 1970 here, is just a little bit after Kent State. And we have this kind of burgeoning, breaking culture war. We have hippies as a big cultural force, but obviously the backlash to hippiedom is huge, and I think maybe underrepresented when we think of the story of the late 60s and the hippies. And then the other element to put into this is New York City itself, because we're going to talk about an incident that takes place in New York City in May, but New York City itself going through really hard times, and on May 6th is the moment when John Lindsay, New York's mayor, says, quote, the country is virtually on the edge of a spiritual and perhaps even physical breakdown. We are starting to head into that kind of Ford to New York drop dead kind of thing. But New York City itself is going in through some really tough times, and I think starting to represent a little bit of the kind of like cultural fissures that are emerging, which all brings us to May 8th. which is the day of the so-called Hard Hat Riot.
Yeah. This riot is kind of interesting because when you think about the 1960s and even into the early 70s, it is protest season, and college students are out organizing, and they're protesting the death of 4 students at Kent State that happened not too long before this. And so they marched to the New York Stock Exchange at like 7:30 in the morning.
Which, to get a bunch of college kids to wake up at 7:30 in the morning, I gotta say.
Several hundred of them.
You have to really care.
Several hundred of them gather and they start protesting. And across the way are construction workers, hundreds of construction workers that see these protesters and become incensed. And not only are they incensed, but also you have hundreds of office workers who are working downtown who see these protesters and become outraged by them. And it's interesting because rarely will you see like construction workers and white collar workers sort of banding together, but they do in this way. And they start to shout at the protesters. And they start to chant, USA all the way, because they see these college students as unpatriotic. The students are yelling back at them, peace now. And the police aren't really there at first. They start to show up, they sort of trickle in, but it's not clear like how they're going to navigate this situation. So they start to create sort of like a line between the college students and the construction workers. And it's only a matter of time before words are exchanged and it heats and it explodes. And construction workers start to break those police lines, attack college students. They take off their hard hats. They start to hit the college students, literally pummeling them. And for all the people who are being attacked, primarily college students, the police are not intervening. The police are not at all there to protect the protesters or to break up this riot that ensues, in which hundreds of people are wounded. Hard hats are just that, hard hats. These are weapons,
and steel toe boots.
Yeah,
and tools. But
it's a serious beat down. I would never want to get in a brawl with a construction worker. This is a violent outbreak for students who are really trying to protest, again, the death of 4 students and also the Vietnam War and other things. But, it's meant to be a peaceful protest.
This is one of those moments where the counter-protesters, who aren't always part of our story of the protests of the 1960s, we see them, in the Black civil rights protests, right? You see the massive resistance, white resistors to those protests. But at the Vietnam protests, we don't often see the counter-protesters. And that's what you see kind of coming to life in this moment, is this array of people who Nixon identifies as the silent majority coming together to protest the protesters. And there's actually this very fascinating symbolic moment, because across New York City, all of the flags were at half-staff to protest the killings or to honor the students who were killed at Kent State. And the hard hat rioters are like, we're proud of our country. This isn't something we should be mourning. Those flags need to go all the way up. And so there's an actual battle over where the flag sits on the flagpole, and it's raised up and it's brought down and it's raised up again in this very kind of literal symbolism over country and patriotism that has been boiling in the United States probably since the mid-1960s.
I just got to say, look, I know part of the story of U.S. history and New York history is that stuff happens and then very quickly it's forgotten. But gosh, I didn't know about this. We're talking about 20,000 people. If people in New York City can picture this, Lower Manhattan, this is like near the intersection of Wall Street and Broad Street. We're talking about 20,000 people, construction workers bursting through a line of cops, beating down kids holding flags. There's an attack and a siege on Pace University, which people know is right down there by the Brooklyn Bridge, which is seen as a little more conservative than other universities maybe. But the fact that this happened and you just kind of like move on and forget about it is remarkable.
And the fact that you could just be a bystander and look like a hippie.
Yes.
If you were a man with long hair, or, you were wearing some of the latest trends, you could also be attacked just trying to get where you were going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Your tie-dye is a target.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. And, I think that gets to what we see in here, and then what we see Nixon, I think, capitalize on a few weeks later at the White House, where he gathers labor leaders. But is this kind of interesting re-scrambling of social, cultural, and political allegiances, right? Because I think the picture we briefly sketched out of the 50s and 60s, labor was seen as generally progressive. Dems, you could see a sort of common cause between kids who are trying to kind of like secure their future and labor unions that are trying to fight for the rights of sort of workers in the middle class. And instead here we have this moment, as you said, Kellie, like office workers and construction workers are weirdly aligned because the cultural skim on top of them is what connects them. It's like hippies versus quote unquote normies is more important than sort of political or economic interests in this moment.
And Nixon loves this. Nixon had been leaning into the patriotism thing. He holds this big rally called Honor America Day in 1970 also because it's, this idea that if we lean hard on patriotism, that is actually one of those things that's going to begin to break up this Democratic coalition. And Nixon was very methodical and strategic about this. He understood that the Democratic coalition was a challenging one to hold together, right? It contained white Southern segregationists and black civil rights activists. It contained anti-war protesters and hippies and these construction workers who saw themselves as kind of the backbone of America and had some conservative cultural values. And Nixon seizes every opportunity he can. I mean, he even embraces affirmative action for a while because he believes that supporting black workers is going to hit on the racial lines in unions and in the workforce and start to break up that Democratic coalition. And so he sees these hard hatters rioting and he's just like, all of my best laid plans are coming to fruition. And as you opened with that scene in the White House, and that's just him leaning right into it. And the labor unions are there for it.
The patriotism is what, okay, am I crazy? But is it me or do I feel like every time I hear the chant, USA, USA, it feels so cringe to me now. And I don't know if that's because it's been co-opted in this way to make it feel like it feels very empire. I don't know. It just feels like I can't, as much as I love this country, it feels so difficult to hear those things because it is almost always weaponized against some underdog, some either a college student or a poor person or an immigrant that is being unfairly targeted, and USA is being shoved down their throats or thrown in their face. It just all those elements feel very resonant.
I feel like I encounter that chant a lot in sports context too, and it's maybe bled back into the rest of the world. In sports, as much as I love sports, I think there's so many lessons to be learned from it. It is ultimately at the end about a winner and a loser, and so it just sort of has that
vibe,
that vibe of we won, you lost, we're going to defeat you, and that's not how the world actually works. It's not always a zero-sum game. I certainly don't think being a citizen of the world is a zero-sum game, but I think that's kind of a little of what makes me uneasy about it as well. So before we get back to this incident this event at the White House with labor leaders, and I want to talk about one of the leaders there in particular who's really fascinating. Just NIki, the picture you painted of the kind of backlash to the anti-war protests. I mean, there's a poll that's released around this moment where people say that Americans thought that campus unrest was a bigger problem than the Vietnam War itself.
Yes, because millions of people were dying on a regular basis on college campuses, whereas Vietnam was mostly about debate. And so you can see why those are obviously I read that statistic and we are living in this exact same moment with Gaza in college campuses, right? The college unrest is the problem. The people who are dying, that's not our concern. Even though in the case of Vietnam, obviously it was both American citizens being drafted to fight in the war and then, of course, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who were being killed in the war.
Which makes a poll like this even more gobsmacking because it actually was sort of hitting people. Most Americans probably weren't affected by college campuses. Most Americans probably were affected by the draft,
Yes, because college students you could opt out. If you were in college, you couldn't be drafted into the war.
Which certainly leads to some of the resentment, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. That becomes a real pain point. My dad was a construction worker who got drafted to Vietnam, and he wasn't protected by college. And so he had to go. And I think that there was this sense of these rich kids aren't subject to the draft, but we are. I do think there is something worth lingering on in addition to the resonances with today. And that is, often when we talk about the silent majority, the kind of quip is they were neither silent nor a majority. Like conservatives definitely weren't a majority in the U.S. And these hard hats were not silent. But you look at these polls and you look at polls, surrounding William Kellie, who was responsible for the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. He had immense public support. The hard hat rioters have immense public support. And so there is something to this idea that in this kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a culture war, just the politics of the Nixon administration, there really are, a ton of Americans who are supportive of this kind of framework that doesn't necessarily fit with conditions on the ground. Again, like college campuses just weren't the center of the violence of the U.S. empire, but that also they were the central concern, and built a lot of political careers in this period.
Hey there, it's David Plotz, host of Slate's Political Gabfest, the longest-running politics podcast. It can be hard to know what news is worth your attention, which is why every week my co-hosts Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson and I find the most important stories of the week so you don't have to. We dig into everything from Trump's immigration policies to critical court cases and everything in between. We also keep some good humor while doing it.
Why is the Tic Tac shaped that way?
Listen to the Political Gabfest now and join us as we go even deeper on the daily news you're already following. That's Political Gabfest, wherever you get your podcasts.
Tariffs, meme coins, Girl Scout cookies. What do these all have in common? Come on, folks. It's all about the money. Economics is everywhere and everything. It's fueling our lives, even where we least expect it. And look, if you listen to this day, that means I know that you are interested in context and the hidden stories that help explain our world. So I recommend to you that you listen to Planet Money from NPR. The Planet Money is a different kind of world where the complex economy actually makes sense. Human stories instead of abstract theories. It is econ brought down to earth. For me, going all the way back to 2008 and the giant pool of money, where Planet Money first helped me understand the financial crisis, I have relied on this show. It is accessible, it is fun, it's surprising. It's one of those shows that when you listen to it, you kind of think to yourself, why isn't this the only show that I listen to? Another great thing I'll tell you about Planet Money, they are absolute pioneers in the shorter podcast. It's about 30 minutes. You'll learn a lot. You get in, get out, nice and accessible. So it's time to check it out. Tune in to Planet Money every week for entertaining stories and insights about how money shapes our world. These are stories that cannot be found anywhere else. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR. So here's something that happens every year as it gets warmer. I put away my winter clothes, I take a look at my closet, and I think to myself, man, my rotation is pretty worn out. Same polos, same shorts, same lightweight pants as last year. So I have to buy a bunch of items to feel like I'm ready to embrace summer. Now, let me tell you about something that doesn't happen every year. Me getting compliments on the summer clothes that I purchased. But I am here to tell you, listener, that it has been happening ever since I refreshed my wardrobe with some items from Quince. Just last week on a taping of this show, Kellie said, "That's a really nice polo shirt." It is, and it's actually called a cotton silk polo sweater. It's got a nice little white trim, some great texture to the material. I've got these linen pants that are getting some compliments. They cost under $50, by the way. Same with the chore jacket I got. A friend of mine at the bar the other day reached over and did that little, ooh, this is nice thing, and felt the fabric. Listeners, this could be you. Quince's pieces are easy, elevated, and somehow make you feel more put together without even trying. Treat your closet to a little summer glow up with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. Before we get going, and as we move to this event at the White House. I just want to give a shout out to an author, David Paul Kuhn, who's a historian and writer and wrote a book a few years ago called The Hard Hat Riot. He has really dug into this issue, but also I think is a really great chronicler of how the kind of white working class turned against Democrats and the culture wars intervened in many ways to re-scramble the allegiances. So as we go to this event at the White House, I want to take a moment to talk for a second about Peter J. Brennan, who was a labor leader from New York. He is the vice president of the New York State AFL-CIO. He's one of the most prominent labor leaders in the country. He is clashing with John Lindsay, New York's mayor, and he really starts to kind of use the Vietnam War as a kind of cultural cleave and a way to kind of move his members away from Democrats. And he adopts this stance, which is so resonant to now, but he basically says, we are anti-war, right? And we see that so much now. You know, we see the anti-Trump, as a stance that then allows you to sort of make common cause with some pretty unsavory folks. And I feel like, any antis more than one, I start to get pretty suspicious. There's been times when I'm like, am I anti-Trump? And I'm like, no, I'm just anti-Trump.
I think that's actually really important because the more antis you get, the more meta the conversation is and the less it's about the actual thing.
Yes.
And maybe it more gravitates towards like culture and vibes and sort of signifiers more than the actual issue at hand.
Well, because you're distancing yourself from the issue and now you're in conversation with how you feel about the protests around the issue.
But also, I mean, there are other people that are like, there's more to this narrative than just pushing back against college students, that, there's a real debate between Brennan and the Mayor Lindsay about like integrating the trade unions, and this becoming actually the real feature of this is that we don't want Black and brown people in our unions. We don't want them taking our jobs. And always comes back to race. I don't know, like we can never discount it. Always comes back to race in some form or fashion, in which there are other things that I think surface level, sure, there's class resentment, but that racial component can never sort of be downplayed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And is exacerbated because we're also at the tail end of the post-war economic boom. And so as the resources get scarcer and scarcer, the tensions get higher and higher, and they exacerbate those pre-existing racism and anti-women attitudes. All of those things get amplified in this moment because people feel like they're losing something.
Yeah. And of course, we have white flight throughout a lot of this era, But yes, I mean, this is the big sort of decades-long story here is about the kind of white working class backlash and a break with labor-friendly and union-friendly policies and a move more towards these larger cultural issues that the Republicans really capitalize on. So, I think you pointed out, NIki, Nixon loves this. He also is savvy enough to take advantage of this. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of intervening decades and kind of how you see Republicans having really doubled down on like embracing this kind of like the cultural element to the white working class?
Absolutely. I mean, this comes out in some ways of the 1968 election and George Wallace being able to draw some of those northern working class white voters. Nixon latches onto that. Reagan latches onto that. Reagan sees a lot of possibility in the white working class vote and leans into it with things like, he launches his campaign or has a campaign stop in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is the site where 3 civil rights advocates were murdered. That kind of Southern strategy is going to continue to be a part of the strategy for the Republican Party. And it's interesting because we call it the Southern strategy. But the exact same strategy that is being used to peel away Southern Democrats is also working to peel away white working class voters in other parts of the country because they are tapping into these kinds of racist resentments, a kind of populist politics that revolves around patriotism that becomes, it sort of morphs over the years. Like by the 1980s and 1990s, you're attacking liberals as the big problem. You're attacking, again, like effete institutions like universities and college professors is the problem. That becomes kind of the leitmotif of Republican rhetoric as you move through the decades. And, Pat Buchanan is obviously a major avatar of this on the right. And, of course, Donald Trump is in many ways the apotheosis of the attempts to win over the white working class. He's just so bald about it, right? Like, he'll talk about loving the poorly educated because he does so well with non-college degree earning white people. And it's an
guy loves to put on a hard hat, loves to jump in a truck.
Loves a truck, loves a big giant construction zone, and comes from real estate, which is construction adjacent.
Again, the pairing of the two, of the working class and the, or I should say the white collar class and the construction workers is telling.
And even more ramped up, right? Because it's the billionaire and the white working class making common cause.
I want to go back to just one moment when we talk about resonances for today. Pete Hamill, one of my favorite and one of the greatest journalists, in New York history, at the time he pointed out, and he wrote, the white working class people felt is the important word here, but white working class people felt, quote, trapped and even worse in a society that purports to be democratic but ignored, and that this riot was an expression of rage in the face of feeling ignored. That is so, that continues to be the exact pattern we see today. And specifically, I want to highlight that word felt. Sometimes there's a disconnect between what's actually happening and what the actual sort of economics are, and the, I think, still genuine resentment that people feel and are, manipulated into feeling.
Mm-hmm. I would emphasize the word felt, and I would also emphasize the word white, because this is a period since the 1970s where wealth inequality has grown dramatically in the United States, where people who are in the bottom 40% have lost ground compared to earlier generations. And if you take the word white away and you just talk about the working class hasn't been well served by either of the two major parties, but they have been sold a narrative about whose fault it is and who is to blame. And it is not the billionaires, but it is instead blame the immigrant workers, blame the Black welfare recipients. Like, these are the people who are the cause of your problems. And it kind of coheres into this white working class identity that gets in the way of a broader kind of working class identity.
Which is crazy to me, because I feel like, the same where it's like you're 2 paychecks away from poverty, but never 2 paychecks away from like wealth. And I think that when we think about when we think about these ideas, it's also the narrative that like these billionaires or even this white collar class is also very aspirational, and so people think that they're also close to it as well, and it's like, no, you're not close to this at all. And really these people want nothing to do with you, but they're weaponizing you to maintain their own power.
Yeah, but I think that's exactly right. I think that's the way that someone like Donald Trump is able to kind of fit into this without it seeming completely absurd, is that there is that aspirational element to it. But obviously nothing actually backs that up. This is the central question, I think, of our politics right now, but do we see this realigning in any sort of meaningful way? Or will it continue to be that Republicans own this hard hat patriotism no matter what the actual kind of policies and economic reality indicates?
The question will really be whether Democrats are able to put up a candidate that looks like this. Candidate that people believe to be authentic in those ideas. Like, I think so many of the previous candidates have been like these highly educated status quo candidates, and I don't think that people trust that on the right. And so unless the Democrats come up with some sort of like construction worker turned candidate, I don't know that I don't even know that would necessarily be convincing.
What about a former bartender?
Well,
who didn't pay off her student loans until
it could. But then I also think about Pennsylvania, the senator from Pennsylvania, Fetterman. Yeah, he was supposed to be that person, and he's not.
Yeah.
He's a very different person, I think, than some people were sold. But I think that actually gets at two of the tensions, which is, do you need an avatar like Fetterman who like looks like the white working class, would that group of voters vote for somebody like AOC, who is Latina, who is a woman, and who has such a robust right-wing media ecosystem that is arrayed against her? The real question, this is, Jody, just not a question we're going to be able to answer, because it is the central question of U.S. politics for most of the last century, which is, as the United States becomes less white, how do you reorganize politics, and how do you build an economy that isn't built on racial and gender stratification, which is the economy that we've always had? And I haven't seen somebody come up with a good answer to that, but that is always going to be, or at least it has always been, the sore spot in labor organizing, labor politics in the United States, is that stratification and people working against that stratification, and the feeling among white workers that they will lose out if you have a fair labor market. Yeah. It is the problem that politicians should be focused on.
All right, well, we will leave it there with that big question lingering in the air. It is still the case that the hard hat is an incredibly powerful symbol. And in fact, if you want to go visit the hard hat that this labor leader Brennan presented to Nixon, it is at the Richard Nixon Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. NIki, you put in some time there, right? Did you see the hard hat?
I have not only put in some time there, but I'm going back this summer. I'm going back in August. So I will take a picture and send it back to the crew.
Great. Okay, we'll put it in the newsletter. And Brennan said at the time, and we'll leave it with these final words, the hard hat will stand as a symbol, along with our great flag, for freedom and patriotism to our beloved country. So, as we've been saying, he who owns the hard hat symbolism runs the country, I suppose. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Buffalo's hard-hatted construction workers, thousands of them, jammed downtown Niagara Square for a Flag Day rally. They sang patriotic songs, presented flags to Mayor Sedita and County Executive Tutuska, and paraded through downtown streets to the cheers of hundreds of spectators and passers-by.
Radiotopia. From